Nuclear Doctrine, Part 2. This is a U.S. Snark cruise missile in a 1957 launch. So here's some terms that you should be familiar with. ICBM, which is Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. IRBM, which is Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile. BMD, which is Ballistic Missile Defense. NMD, which is National Missile Defense. SSBN, which is Ballistic Missile Carrying Submarine. ABM, which is Anti-Ballistic Missile. MIRV, which is Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicles. And you can see here at the bottom a People's Liberation Army Navy sea-launched ballistic missile. So here we're going to look at the evolution and sequence of nuclear doctrine in relationship to the emergence of technical challenges. This is a universal model that I propose every single country has to go through. It's metaphorical because countries do have different challenges, so they don't always face the challenges in this particular sequence. But it's a rough template that I believe can be modified with just a few sequences changed. So at the initial stage, you have a nuclear version of Allied strategic bombing during World War II, which is basically the doctrine between 1945 and 1950. Instead of having airplanes with conventional bombing, the airplanes were equipped with atomic bombs. In 1947, there were 70 targets in the Soviet Union, and the US assigned 3 bombs per target. After the Soviet nuclear test in 1949, the US adopted deterrence through massive retaliation. This was articulated by President Eisenhower in National Security Council Memoranda 68. The goal was to hit vulnerable enemy cities with a massive nuclear strike permitting a smaller conventional force. You can see here a US naval officer standing next to a Japanese balloon that was sailed over to the US during the Second World War. Now, the basis for a lot of this logic is rational deterrence theory. This is a theory that developed from the 1950s through the 1970s as a policy, not an academic analysis, of what the US needed to do to be able to protect its allies with its nuclear arsenal. Now, when it developed into an academic theory, there were identified 3 necessary conditions for deterrence to work. First, capability. A country has to have enough capability to be able to threaten punishment on other states. 2, this needs to be communicated. 3, it has to be believable that a country would use its arsenal in order to defend itself or its allies. The problem with nuclear weapons is they're, to some extent, unusable because they're seen as immoral, because they're dramatically escalatory. You can see here US Mark 33 and Mark 48 artillery launched tactical nuclear warheads. So we go through the first tactical problem. Here's the problem of the threat of enemy attack. So the solution is to shift from counter-value targeting, which is bombing cities, to targeting counter-force assets, which is targeting the enemy's military, their supply bases, their airfields, their ports, where their military units are stationed. And then to develop a plan to preempt the enemy attack. So if the enemy has nuclear bombers or nuclear missiles, to watch them with spy aircraft and spy satellites, and if any movement is seen in preparation for attack, to attack first. Now, counterforce targeting typically, which consists of groundburst attacks to get maximum blast against the target. However, of course, this also leads to maximum fallout. This plan was first suggested by Robert McNamara, the US Defense Secretary, in 1962. It was proposed because he believed that authoritarian states, like Communist Soviet Union, cared more for their militaries than their cities, because the militaries protected the political party against the population. Counter-value targeting, which is to hit soft targets, civilian targets like cities, is done by using an airburst. And so it minimizes fallout. Now, this is often called a preemption strategy. If it's believed that the enemy is about to attack, then one's own missiles will attack first. This typically requires excellent intelligence and was possible for the US in the 1950s and 60s, especially as the US could see and observe as the Soviets fueled their liquid-fueled missiles, which took usually about an hour. Now, there remains an unsolved problem. If missiles are designed for counterforce, meaning they're designed to destroy Soviet missiles and Soviet military forces, it's destabilizing. Because if the enemy launches their missiles first, then the missiles you have become useless. They're basically being fired at empty silos. This disposition therefore encourages launching on short notice, or LUA, launch under attack, where you plan to launch your missiles when you see the enemy's missiles coming at you, and they plan to launch their missiles when they see your missiles coming at them. And this is destabilizing, because it means that people are willing to launch missiles under very short notice with limited information. And so there's a high likelihood of a mistake. So this is a source of instability. It's deterring because you're promising a response, but it might undermine stability because it leads to the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. You can see below, in 2007, the internal plan of the People's Liberation Army Navy Type 094 ballistic missile submarine that ultimately became the JIN class. Problem number 2. Preemption strikes and the reciprocal fear of surprise attack and decapitation. Now, Jimmy Carter, the American president, came up with a countervailing strategy. This was a decapitation strategy. The goal was to destroy bunker complexes in the Soviet Union, killing the senior communist leadership, inhibiting their ability to conduct the war. So the first solution is a second strike capability. To take nuclear weapons and put them in silos in the ground, on submarines, at dispersed airfields with bombers, or to make them mobile on the road or the rail system. This way they acquire second strike capability. The missiles are able to survive being attacked in a first strike, and enough missiles are able to then be launched to still have a robust deterrence or a robust punishment on the opponent. This is called mutually assured destruction. This was never a policy. It was, however, a description of the outcome when two states are facing off against each other with second strike. It's seen as desirable because it's stable, because there's no incentive to attack first, there's no benefits of surprise. The second solution is to have decapitation attacks against enemy decision-making and missile control centers. So, instead of being concerned about instability, this strategy is simply to have a military solution and destroy the enemy before they can launch. It doesn't solve the problem of the mutual fear or reciprocal fear of surprise attack. For example, there was consideration during the Kennedy administration of a minimum deterrence doctrine. This was for a minimal second strike force. It was ultimately rejected because if a force is too small, it doesn't reassure allies. In other words, it's not good for extended deterrence. Allies do not believe a small arsenal can protect them and all the different allies. Here you can see a Scud tractor erector launcher. On top is a Soviet Typhoon ballistic missile submarine, one of which Canada disassembled in a Discovery TV show. Underneath is a Soviet ICBM on transporters. Third problem, the lack of credibility because of an attack under the threshold of response. For example, the Korean War. The US had a policy of massive retaliation, but then the Soviets provided a nuclear umbrella, because they had nuclear weapons, to China, which did not have nuclear weapons, and China sent in a large conventional force to intervene in the Korean War. And the US could not stop them with their nuclear arsenal. The first solution is conventionalization. This is to mix conventional armies with the robustness of tactical nuclear weapons. And this is where tactical nuclear weapons were first developed. Here you can see US SRAMs, short-range attack missiles, being loaded on a B-52. The second solution is the creation of many different attack options with the strategic nuclear forces. President Kennedy, who followed President Eisenhower, came up with a policy of flexible response to replace Eisenhower's massive retaliation. Now, instead of a plan to destroy all the Soviet cities, there were faster, smaller plans just to destroy airfields, just to destroy energy centers, just to destroy ports. And these options allowed the US president to give a proportionate nuclear response, rather than have a choice of fire everything or fire nothing. Here you can see the Soviets using a jet engine to decontaminate the chemical weapons off of their tanks. Fourth problem, extended deterrence. How do you assure the credible deterrence against an enemy attack on your ally with nuclear weapons? Well, the argument is basically, what are the incentives for State A to risk its cities protecting State B against State C? Why would the US risk New York to protect Berlin on behalf of Germany against the Soviet Union? Why would the Americans care? The problem is, of course, that if the Germans believed that the US was not prepared to attack the Soviet Union in a war in Germany, because the US did not want itself to be attacked, then Germany would build its own nuclear weapons. Read my book. There was a time when Germany threatened to cooperate with France to develop nuclear weapons. The solution is IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, where the US deployed the Pershing I missile in Germany so that the US's fate, at least the fate of the US military in West Germany, was tied to that of Germany. And the US shared tactical nuclear weapons with its allies. So if a war broke out, the allies were confident that the US would share the same fate and would likely use its nuclear weapons to save its military, and that the Germans themselves had some input in the decision of when to use tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, historically there was still a divide. Germany wanted to use the tactical nuclear weapons at the very beginning on the East German border. They did not want their country to be overrun before they used tactical nuclear weapons. The Americans, on the other hand, were inclined to use tactical nuclear weapons after Germany was largely overrun and the Soviets were about to cross the Rhine. And that dispute was never quite resolved. Here you can see a picture of a Pershing II rocket. These were introduced in the 1980s as a follow-on to the Pershing I. The US deployed these in Germany, and cruise missiles were deployed in Sicily, Belgium, and Holland. And these were all to indicate that the US was committed to defending Europe. And the positive outcome for the US was that the European states, with the exception of England and France, did not develop their own nuclear arsenals. Nuclear weapons were stationed at a great many dispersed sites, which are indicated in the map on the top right. And a list of nuclear warheads deployed in Europe for different local, tactical, and theater weapons is listed in the chart. The Pershing I is the missile depicted here. This was a dual key system controlled by both Germany and the US. It did not have the range to reach the USSR and could probably hit Poland. You can see on the map the range of the Pershing II rocket, which in fact did have a much more significant range, and the range of cruise missiles and Poseidon missiles against the Soviet Union. You can also see the location of cruise missile and Pershing bases located in Sicily, Holland, Belgium, Germany, and England. The French solution was for autonomy. Rather than rely on a US deterrent, the French developed the force de frappe, which included Pluton missiles, which are tactical and short range, Hades missiles that could reach out to the edge of East Germany, tactical fighters that could attack targets in Eastern Europe, and the Mirage 4 that could deliver a thermonuclear weapon to Moscow. Problem 5. Intercontinental ballistic missile silos become vulnerable to attack as missiles become more accurate. The solution is to develop BMD, Ballistic Missile Defense. And this is not to protect cities, but to protect the bases where missiles are deployed. You might recall the K factor we looked at with Dunnigan, in which US missiles became so accurate that the Soviets became compelled to deploy their missiles on trucks and trains. Here you can see that chart, which you've seen before. The K factor is essentially the equivalent megatonnage divided by the circular error probability. So the solution is to also develop mobile ICBMs. This here is a People's Liberation Army mobile cruise missile and its launcher. Problem 6. Third-party nuclear forces threaten one's own forces and may conduct a surrogate attack for another power. After China's 1964 nuclear weapons detonation, the US feared the far more radical Chinese would be used by the Soviet Union to attack the US. The solution was to develop NMD, National Missile Defense, to protect counter-value targets like cities against unsophisticated third parties. Here you can see a picture of the Soviet SS-11 Sago intercontinental ballistic missile. Problem 7. While mobile ICBMs and ballistic missile submarines make preemption more likely by encouraging conventional attacks because of super-perfect nuclear stability. This is called the stability-instability paradox. It's a paradox because you have two countries with very strong second strike nuclear forces. Any use of nuclear forces by one side leads to nuclear forces on the other. Because of this, nuclear weapons cannot be used by either side. The result is one of the countries decides to use conventional weapons. And the other side can't respond with nuclear weapons because the nuclear weapons are deterred. So they respond with conventional weapons. So the result is a conventional war in which nuclear weapons are not used. This was partially the case in World War II. The Nazis and the Allies agreed not to use chemical weapons like they had in World War I, and instead they fought the war with conventional weapons. There were no chemical strikes on cities, even though both sides had prepared to fight that way. An example of the stability-instability paradox is the Soviet Union and China fighting their border war in 1969. The US had an arsenal of nuclear weapons that they'd accumulated since 1949, and China had detonated their nuclear weapon in 1964. It was during the Cultural Revolution, so China was behaving aggressively, but the Soviet Union's overwhelming arsenal and China's relatively small arsenal canceled each other out. And so the Chinese and Soviets fought a border war at several locations on their frontier. 1999, Pakistan deploys soldiers into Kashmir at the peak of the mountains, the Northern Light Infantry. It does it after India in 1998, followed by Pakistan in 1998, detonate their nuclear weapons. So India and Pakistan's nuclear arsenals, even though they were small, canceled each other out. They could not use them. They also could not use them because they depended heavily on trade and depended on Western allies. And they didn't want to alienate other countries. So for alliance reasons and reasons of international prestige and international standing, they also couldn't use nuclear weapons. This made war safe at the conventional level. So India had to deploy soldiers and artillery and recapture each of the mountain peaks during the crisis in Kargil, Kashmir. Now, because NATO's policy was based on the threat of nuclear first use, because NATO anticipated that if the Soviet Union attacked, NATO's army would not be strong enough to protect West Germany for long, NATO needed to undermine this stability by somehow destroying the Soviet nuclear force before a nuclear war was fought. So NATO needed a way to solve the stability-instability paradox. Below is a US air-launched cruise missile concept using an airframe of a 747. Never realized. But you can imagine there must be like 200 cruise missiles in that airplane. Problem 7, solutions. Solution 1 was the development of stealth bombers to hunt down mobile Soviet ICBMs. This is why the B-2 bomber was developed. It was not developed to fly to Afghanistan and chase a pickup truck full of militants. It was designed to float above the Soviet Union and wipe out the mobile ICBM force so that the Soviet Union would be vulnerable if ever they had to use their nuclear weapons. Therefore, the Soviet Union would never start a war, knowing that if they started a war, they would lose their nuclear weapons capability. So the Soviet Union would have to attack first in a surprise attack with nuclear weapons. And so it neutralized the conventional army in the Soviet calculation. They could never attack and win with a conventional force because they would lose their strategic force and be vulnerable to a nuclear attack. The second solution was to shift to a conventional counterforce strategy. Colin Gray was a British Canadian who worked in the Pentagon in the Office of Nuclear Targeting. And he proposed a plan in which the Allies, the Americans, the British and French, would create a large carrier force, up to 6 aircraft carriers, move it up the Norwegian coast into the Barents Sea, wipe out the Soviet fleet, and then protect fleets of hunter-killer submarines as they chased and destroyed the Soviet ballistic missile fleet. Once the Soviets lost their ballistic missile submarines, again, they would be vulnerable. They would have no way of firing nuclear weapons at the US before the US fired nuclear weapons at the Soviet forces because the US had more accuracy and it could conduct a first strike. So, the first solution is to create nuclear instability, to break the stability-instability paradox. And it was done by doing conventional counterforce strategy. So you use conventional forces, not nuclear forces, to target the enemy's nuclear weapons. Now an SS-25, which is a mobile system in the Soviet Union, can be located by examining their exercises, by signals intelligence, by photo intelligence. And the B-2s, in conjunction with sea-launched ballistic missiles launched from submarines, such as the Trident W-76 with a 100-kiloton warhead, can accurately hit an identified SS-25 launcher if launched within 20 minutes, and the vehicle is moving no more than an average speed of 20 kilometers an hour. One W-76 warhead, and there's multiple W-76 warheads in each Trident, can kill an SS-25 launcher in a 26 square kilometer area if detonated at 1,250 meters, with the overall damage radius of being 2,875. So this is why the B-2 bomber was developed. It was not developed to fly to Afghanistan and chase a pickup truck of militants with laser-guided bombs. It was meant to float above the Soviet Union at night and conduct a counterforce conventional attack so that the Soviet Union's mobile nuclear forces would be destroyed, and then the Soviet Union would realize they could never attack NATO with conventional forces because the conventional forces would not be protected by a nuclear umbrella. Therefore, the stability-instability paradox would be solved. Here again is the map you saw earlier of the location of where the Soviet mobile forces were located. And again, you've seen this before, where the two blue submarines are located are the two strategic bastions for the ballistic missile submarines. Problem number 8. Ballistic missile defenses. These are the missile defenses that are designed to protect the missile silos against incoming accurate missiles and against third parties like an unreliable communist China or a provocative North Korea or a Cuba with nuclear weapons that's very radical. The ballistic missile defense reduces retaliatory enemy second strike, making first strike counterforce attack feasible. What does this mean? We think of missile defense as defensive. It's like a shield. So it should be stability enhancing. It should encourage deterrence. It should remove the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. But that's wrong. When you build a missile defense, it right away weakens the enemy's retaliation capability. Because once you've built your shield, you can then conduct a first strike against the enemy's arsenal. The enemy's arsenal is then damaged. It may be damaged enough that when they retaliate and launch, the surviving missiles can't get through your defense shield. Knowing this, they have an incentive to attack you with nuclear weapons before your missile defense is finished, its construction. You knowing this, you have an incentive to launch your nuclear weapons before they launch their nuclear weapons. So we actually return to a problem of a reciprocal fear of surprise attack. So ballistic missile defense doesn't enhance deterrence, it undermines deterrence. This is the reason why the 1972 ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was passed between the Soviet Union and the US, and they both agreed to limit defense to 2 sites. Of course, the intention was to have 1 site at the capital and 1 site at an ICBM field. So the Soviets built their first site at Moscow, which included nuclear-tipped interceptors. We will look at that whole plan later. The Americans deployed theirs at an ICBM field. The Americans eventually decided that the system was unworkable. Technically, it would work, but it would be very costly. So they canceled it. And the Soviet Union and the US entered into negotiations and agreed to limit ABM sites to a single site. Ultimately, the Americans had no ABM, and the Soviets had and continue to have an ABM site around Moscow. And then in the 2000s, the US investigated the policy of canceling the ABM treaty. They had decided that because Soviet arsenals were shrinking, and China would probably become the next challenger, that the treaty no longer served any purpose. It was in pursuit of this that I was offered a research grant to work at the Office of Treaty Verification in the Office of the Secretary of the Navy at the Pentagon. So I got to work at the Pentagon, which was very interesting, and the State Department. And ultimately, we contributed a report and did some published research, and the US government canceled the treaty. Here you can see a picture of Robert Oppenheimer. Problem 9. MIRV warheads increase incentives to attack the other side. MIRVs are, of course, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles that you can see in this graphic, where you've got warheads on a bus. This was a rapid development in the 1970s. The US at the beginning of the 1970s were deploying MIRVs, and by the end of the 1970s, the Soviets were deploying MIRVs. It was believed that if you launched one missile, and that missile could launch 6 to 10 warheads, then there was a great new incentive for a surprise first strike. The US developed these in 1971, and the Soviets developed these in 1974. So the solution was to limit MIRV capability. And the more recent arms control agreements have tried to do that. Consequently, some of the SS-19 Soviet missiles and some of the US Minuteman III missiles only have a single warhead. For example, Nixon and Kissinger believed that the possession of greater than minimum deterrence was destabilizing because it gave the appearance of seeking a first strike capability. And looking like you were trying to strike first could actually cause the other side to plan preemptively. In other words, they would launch if they think you're about to launch. And that is destabilizing. Now, there are alternative logics. Critics from India and elsewhere have argued that the Western experience of nuclear weapons is culturally rather than technologically driven. Here you can see the ranges of the People's Liberation Army DF-5A and its range to US cities. It's actually the main and quite old ICBM that China built to target the US. It was actually deployed when China and the US were closest in terms of strategic alliances in 1981, which is rather peculiar. There were only 20 missiles, and they're still there, but they've been superseded by about 30 or 40 DF-31 mobile ICBMs that are solid fueled, so they can be launched very quickly, and have MIRVs, which means they have multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, meaning they carry many warheads. Consider this map for a few moments for next class.